Let's begin. Here are threats in puzzle position. Rook takes rook. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Rook takes rook. d5. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Rook to g7, check. King to e8. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: rook takes knight. Rook takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight, check. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. The checks are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. Solution to the puzzle is: pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. King to g1. Bishop takes rook. Another one. Threats in puzzle position are: pawn takes pawn, check. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in this position are: pawn takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using: pawn takes pawn, check. King to e8. Rook to c8, check. Bishop to d8. b7. Rook to b1, check. King to d2. Another one. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: king takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. f4, check. The answer is f4, check. King to e6. g5. Another one. The threats are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. King to h2. King to c4. g3. One more. The threats are: bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: bishop to d7. Bishop to d1. Bishop to h3. Another one. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is: king to b3. b5. King takes pawn. King to d4. King to b2. Another one. Here are the threats. There are no threats in this position. Checks in this position are: rook to h4, check. The puzzle is solved using: f7. Rook to g6, check. King to e5. h2. Rook to f1. Let's continue. The threats are: rook takes pawn, check. King takes pawn. Here are the checks. Rook takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using: king takes pawn. Rook to f3. Rook to g4. King to h3. King to g5. g3. Rook to b4. f6. Rook to b8. One more. The threats are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Answer to this puzzle is: f3. Rook to f8. Bishop to f5. King to d2. King to f4. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight to f3. Rook to e7. Queen takes pawn. Rook to g7. Knight takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. Threats in this position are: queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight, check. Knight takes knight. Knight takes bishop. Pawn takes bishop. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes knight, check. The answer is: knight takes knight. Pawn takes knight. Rook takes rook. Bishop takes rook. Rook takes rook, check. Queen takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are: there are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. b6. King to a6. King to d5. Bishop to b2. King to c6. Bishop to a1. b7. King to a7. King to c7. Bishop to e5, check. King to c8. Another one. The threats are: pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is: b3. h6. Promotes to queen. Knight takes queen. b2. h7. Promotes to queen. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are: rook takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. Pawn takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes knight, check. Answer to this puzzle is rook to f8, b7, check. Bishop takes pawn. Rook to c1, check. Knight to c6. Another one. Threats in this position are rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes rook. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook to g5, check. The puzzle is solved using king to f4. Rook takes rook, check. Pawn takes rook, check. King to h5. King to e4. c6. b4. Pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are rook takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. The checks are rook to f3, check. Rook to d2, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to g1, check. Queen to f1, check. Queen to e1, check. The answer is rook to d2, check. Queen to e2. Queen to d1. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are the threats. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. Here are checks in puzzle position. Rook takes pawn, check. The best move in puzzle position is queen takes pawn. c3. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn, check. Rook takes bishop. Rook takes bishop. Rook to h4. Queen takes rook. Queen takes queen. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are queen takes pawn. Queen takes queen. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Queen to d4. Bishop to f5. Knight takes pawn. Rook takes knight. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. Rook takes queen. Let's see the next puzzle. Here are the threats. King takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. The answer is king to b3. a4. King takes pawn. a5. King to b5. Another puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Bishop takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Here are the checks. Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes knight, check. Bishop to f8. Queen to e8. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen. Bishop takes bishop. Another puzzle. The threats are rook takes rook. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn, check. The checks are queen to d3, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook to g7, check. The puzzle is solved using rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Queen to d3, check. King to h8. Queen to g3. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are king takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Here is the solution to the puzzle. d6. Bishop to c6. King to e7. f4. e6. a2. Bishop to b2. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is king to e6. f4. King to d5. King to f3. King to d4. g5. Pawn takes pawn. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are queen takes pawn, check. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. g5, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Answer to this puzzle is g5, check. King to g4. Queen to e4. Queen to h6. King to f7. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.